Awesome, thank you. And with that, I would like to introduce our wonderful speaker. I have to, before I introduce Stuart, I do have to tell you that my first meeting with Stuart was when he had just started working with Texas Sea Grant. And not dissimilar to this, we threw him into a workshop on climate change communication and said, oh, and what you're going to do, since you've only been with Sea Grant for about 2 weeks, is you're going to talk about all the work that Sea Grant has done in climate change communication. And like an absolute trooper, he did it. So he's great. I have great respect for him. So a little more about Stuart. Stuart Carlton is the Healthy Coastal Ecosystems and Social Science Specialist at Texas Sea Grant. He studies the role of science, data, and expertise in people's conceptions of controversial environmental issues. He has a PhD in interdisciplinary ecology from University of Florida. And prior to being at Texas Sea Grant, he was a postdoc research assistant in the Natural Resources Social Science Lab at Purdue University. He's also worked as a middle school science teacher, a marine fisheries biologist, and was the second best beer vendor in the city. With that, Stuart, I would very much thank you for your time, and please have at it. Wait, we can't hear you.
Now we are unmuted, I believe. Sorry about that.
That's perfect.
I told the tech guy yesterday, don't worry, I got this covered. I know all the technology, digital native. Thank you for your time, everybody. And it's always exciting to talk about the research and stuff that I've done. This is summarizing about a half, maybe a third of what the type of work that I do since I started my dissertation. And so it's kind of interesting to go through and collect some of this stuff and to try to get it together. And so I've turned on the webcam because I know that people fall asleep during these things. And so I have this human touch by you can see me and already we're snapped to attention and less likely to fall asleep. That said, I also know how attractive I am, so I'm now going to turn off the webcam and we'll start the actual webinar itself. Okay, I think that is up. So the title of what I'm doing is Climate Change Beliefs and Adaptation Attitudes, Lessons from the More or Less, let's share the screen. All right,
yes.
Are we good?
We're good, thank you.
Digital native, I got this stuff down, don't even worry about it.
You do, you got it, you're great.
I do not need rehearsal. Okay. Anyway, climate change beliefs and adaptation attitudes, lessons from the more or less real world. And I say more or less real world because even in Sea Grant, where we're really out there working with stakeholders, you know, we're not there for people's day-to-day existences, of course. And so up on this screen, part of my background here, these are some graphs that I made, just sort of as an underlying the climatological context that we're operating in. This is sea level rise over the last 80 to 100 years. In different places across the country. And I made this as part of an extension project that I'm working on. But just that reminder that we have that ticking out there as we think about these issues. And you know, I work with Sea Grant, and so sea level rise is a very salient and important issue for us. And it's happening and happening rapidly in some instances. Before we get going, we're just gonna, there we go. I have some acknowledgements. I want to do that because they tend to get lost in the end. Primarily, of course, Texas Sea Grant, my employer. They allow me to do a lot of really interesting work and give me a lot of freedom to work on what I want to work on within the Sea Grant context, and I think that's really important and great. Some of this work was funded by USDA, some by NOAA, some by Florida Sea Grant, and I was part of this big USDA project called Useful to Usable, which is one of the most amazing things I've ever been associated with, and that was headed up by my postdoc mentor, Linda Prokopi. And you should really go check out agclimateforyou.org. What they lack in URL spelling, they make up for in quality of work. And I did a lot of this stuff at Purdue as well, and so there is Drew Breeze, the greatest Purdue Boilermaker. And one more logo that's important, you may not know this, but this is Sea Grant's 50th anniversary, and they told us that we should push that fact whenever possible, and I think that's really awesome. Because that's 50 years of science and outreach and extension serving coastal resources and coastal resource users.
Thank you, Stuart.
You're welcome. I couldn't be prouder to be a part of it. It's a really fantastic organization. A little bit of meta webinar stuff. Elizabeth covered some of this, and I will reiterate, this ain't ancient Greece. If you have a, you know, I'm not here to pose questions to you and to sit there and pontificate. I'm neither the pontiff nor Socrates. So if you have a question, feel free to speak up. There will be time at the end, though, but we are going to be sort of going past a whole lot of stuff relatively quickly. And so if I have confused you or left something unclear, perish the thought, just let me know, and we'll stop and go back. And if I somehow don't get to something, or you want to really talk about this in more detail, maybe you really want to dig into the methods, which I'm not going to do here, just shoot me an email. You can give me a call. I've tried to cite most of the things here. You can go find the full citations on my website there. And if there's one that's not on there and you need to know it or you need it, just let me know, and I'm happy to get it to you. So I think that's the meta webinar stuff. Now that you've fallen back asleep, I'm going to present you 10 years of climate resilience research in what appears to be about 17 and a half or maybe 16 minutes remaining. So let's go ahead and get started. What I'm going to focus on today is sort of two areas of climate change resilience that I've worked in. The first one is climate change beliefs and attitudes. A lot of my work has been on climate change beliefs and attitudes towards climate change, attitudes towards climate adaptation, those sorts of things. And so we're going to look at that a little bit. Again, a very big, broad strokes overview. And then the second one is climate change communication. So I think that research has some implications for communication and for outreach and for extension that are worth thinking about. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit too, and we'll use this as what I figure will be a months-long discussion as we're thinking about how can we cut across the organization to work together. These are some of the types of theoretical and applied work that I've done, and other people present theirs, and what can we do in the future about that. And so we're going to start with climate change beliefs, and that is not a picture of me as a kid, but it is a picture of me as a researcher. And so let's talk about what my research and other research has shown about climate change beliefs. First of all, most people still do not accept the scientific consensus on climate change. And this includes people up to the highest levels of the US government. What is the scientific consensus? And the scientific consensus is that anthropogenic climate change is happening. I was part of a paper earlier this year, was headed up by John Cook, who's the original 97% dude, and Ed Maybach from the George Mason Center was there, and all these people got together, and we reviewed all of the climate scientist consensus papers and found that consistently nearly all climate scientists believe in human-caused climate change. There's a couple outlier studies, one way low at about 84%, one high at 100%. But pretty much no matter how you look at it, no matter how you ask the survey question, if you do document review or whatever, it's a fairly overwhelming consensus. And I know you know this, but it's worth keeping this in mind as we have this discussion. But this is not so much the case with our stakeholders, with Americans. This is a cool map put together. Now, these are model data. It's not a nationwide survey, but they used an interesting regression model and some demographic information, the folks at Yale did, to come up with this map and try to say, you know, what percent of adults probably think that global warming is happening? And it's over half in most of the country. The yellows are over half, the blues are under half, but it's nowhere near 97%. And this doesn't even get into the idea of anthropogenic climate change or global warming or human-caused global warming. There, all of a sudden, we are looking at a very small percentage relative to the scientific consensus. And that leads me to think that when we're talking about climate change, we should be focusing as an outreach or extension organization on adaptation rather than mitigation issues, because there's a lot of education and a lot of change that needs to happen when it comes to anthropogenic climate change. And then perhaps most disturbingly, almost no adults recognize the scientific consensus on climate change. This is very small percentages of people who think that most scientists think global warming is happening. And I did a study with Linda and some other folks that showed that it's not just climate scientists, but about 92% of scientists across disciplines agree that human-caused global warming is happening. And so that's one thing to keep in mind is most people disagree with the scientific consensus. And the incoming chief of staff yesterday said, said that Donald Trump feels that most climate change is bunk. It's mostly bunk. And so that's inconsistent with the scientific consensus and just worth remembering going forward. Another thing that's worth remembering, though, is that climate change beliefs are not uniform, even within a system. So I talked about this useful to usable, or U to U project. And this was a huge project that spanned the Midwest. And one of the things they did, this was before I got there, although it was still good, even though I wasn't there for it yet, was they surveyed thousands of farmers, farm advisors, and farm advisors about, among other things, their climate change beliefs and adaptation attitudes. And so this is the U to U study region, and I'm not going to name all of those states for you because I won't get them all. But we surveyed kind of across those states, focusing in Indiana, Iowa, and Michigan and Nebraska, at least for some of the other stuff we're talking about. But we wanted to know, what about climate change beliefs and adaptation attitudes? And so this graph shows some of the results, and there's a couple of things that I want to point out to you in the graph. First, let's talk about reading it. If you look at the x-axis, that is the percentage of people who agreed with a statement or who believed in climate change. Notice that it doesn't start at 0. I'm not trying to trick you, but I compressed the axis so that you could see a little bit better, so I could zoom in and you could see the data. The salmon color here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you can, it's circling the salmon colored dot. Those are farm advisors. And the teal color, sort of Sea Grant teal, if you will, those are farmers. And so, do you agree that climate change is happening? They asked a question about climate change, and it turns out about 73%, I believe, 72, 73% of advisors believe that climate change is happening. And about 66% of farmers agree that climate change is happening. Now, when you look at the data another way and look at whether or not climate change is either equally or mostly human-caused, the agreement went way down. Of the farmer advisors, it was just under 50% who agreed with that, and of the farmers, it was, I think, about 42%, 41% who agreed that it was mostly or equally human-caused, and, you know, human and natural cause. So a couple things that I think are important to remember. One is these are different audiences, right? That's a pretty substantial difference when you're talking about the number of people who believe in climate change when you look at advisors versus farmers. And number two is there's sort of a subtlety of belief here. Climate change is happening is one thing, broadly agreed on. Climate change is equally or mostly human caused compared to natural causes is basically disagreed upon. Or, you know, the majority disagree with that statement. So when you're thinking about messaging, you've got to think about the subtle differences between those. Another thing we found was that climate change beliefs and attitudes may not be changed by extreme events, at least in the short run. Okay, so there's this idea that, hey, you know, people don't necessarily believe in climate change now, but if there's a big hurricane or a big drought or some sort of climatic event, maybe that'll cause people to radically shift their viewpoints. Well, right after they did that study in 2012, I think was the year, there was a really bad drought in the Midwest. This was the worst drought in 50 years or more. By some measures, it was the worst drought ever. Crop yields were down to really 15-year lows, which when you consider changes in technologies and growing techniques and genetic engineering, to have a crop yield go down like that is just a disaster. And so the harvest was really bad. Everything was dry. There was little water. Now, of course, thanks to crop insurance, people didn't necessarily lose money, which is sort of an interesting issue of working in agriculture. But it was still a really bad drought that was felt intensely by a lot of the people there. And so shortly after, yeah.
Can I just interrupt real quickly before you get to the results? Jess Whitehead from North Carolina Sea Grant had a question. When you say advisor, do you mean like extension agents, academic advisors, or private consultants? Like what goes into that phrase? Word.
What a great question, Jess. I love it. And the answer is yes to all of those. And we're actually going to talk about the difference in those audiences right there. I don't have the split right in front of me, but the big folks are the private consultants. That's most of what you see. They're called certified crop advisors, is a kind of a consultant's I think that's it's a certification you can get. There are also people like seed dealers, people who work for ConAg or Pioneer or whomever. Those sorts of folks are most of the advisors, but there are the NRCS, what's that, National Resource Conservation, whatever, and those sorts of advisors are in there too. There were a number of public sector advisors, but most of them were private sector advisors. Excellent question.
Yeah,
Does that answer it, Jess?
Yeah. No, that's the only question we have right now. Just one other thing, just a reminder that everybody is automatically muted. So if you have a question, go to the control panel on the right side of your screen and type something into questions, and we'll interrupt Stuart whenever we feel like it.
Yeah,
and
please
get
interrupt,
the question answered.
I'm not watching all the question stuff. I can barely,
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. Okay, go ahead.
I'm operating at peak Stuart right now. Which is horrifying. Anyway, so after this terrible drought, and I'm laughing as I say that, but that, it's not funny. We resurveyed the advisors only because we had email addresses for them and we could do it efficiently. The first survey was primarily a mail survey, although people had the ability.
You still there, Stuart?
Yep.
Stuart?
Yeah. Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you now. We're having a little technical stuff happening here, but
Okay,
keep
I'm on an
going.
island. I blame that.
Okay.
Although Texas's economy is good enough that I should have good internet. Anyway, so if you can still hear me, we resurveyed the advisors because we could afford to resurvey them because we had their email addresses. The farmer survey was, the prior survey was conducted primarily over mail, which is very expensive. Email is obviously very cheap. And so we resurveyed them, though, asking about climate change beliefs and adaptation attitudes. And if I can get it to advance, there we go. Let's look at what we found. So before the drought, here are the sort of categories that people fell into. About 37% of people said climate change is occurring, and it's roughly equally human and natural causes. About 26% said there's insufficient evidence to know whether or not climate change is happening. About 24% said climate change is occurring, but it's primarily naturally caused. About 12% said climate change is occurring and it's mostly human caused. And about 2% said climate change is not occurring. And again, this is the ag advisors. Well, after the drought, there really wasn't much change there. There was no shift in climate change beliefs overall. A few more people thought it was equally in human and natural caused, and a few fewer people thought there was insufficient evidence. But there really just isn't a big change at all in the percentages who believed that, in climate change or what they believed in climate change. We also looked at adaptation attitudes. This is a bean plot here. One cool thing about reviewing a bunch of research is you can also see how my changes in thoughts on data visualization over the last decade. And so let me explain this to you. This is basically a way of displaying data. The bottom part, the dark gray curve, is an approximation of the distribution of the answers before the drought. Things more towards the left are strongly disagreeing or negative opinions towards an adaptation. Things on the right, answers more towards the right are positive opinions towards an adaptation. The gray is after the drought, and again, it's an estimate of the distribution of the answers. The light gray lines are the individual data points, and in the orange there is the average. And so you look, the average adaptation attitude certainly didn't change. The idea I would like to provide advice based on climate forecasts didn't change before and after. The dark gray is not different from the light gray, so there was no shift. And in the interest of saving time, I will review the one that was significant. Farmers should take additional steps to protect farmland from increased weather variability. But there really wasn't, there was a change in that one, but there's just no consistent change in all of these adaptation attitudes. And so, if you're looking for this idea of, some sort of event to cause people to become more concerned with long-run stuff, more concerned with climate change, I don't see a ton of evidence based on the work that we've done that it's going to happen, at least in the short run. Now, it'd be interesting to see what happens after a few years, for example, in California, where they've had prolonged drought, or maybe if there's a couple of bad hurricane seasons in a row or something like that. The context that we have is people largely don't believe in climate change, or at least in human-caused climate change. And it doesn't seem like we can hope that the climate will bail us out on that one. The other thing is, now focusing on climate change communication, one thing that I've learned is that people tend to understand things that are more salient to them. And to highlight that, I'll go back to a study that I did at Florida Sea Grant. It's part of my dissertation research. I'm using expert and non-expert models of climate change to enhance communication. So we did a study in Crystal River, Florida. This is sort of a map view of it. It's a coastal town. It's in red on the thing there, and that purple is Lake Okeechobee, so that's water. But the red is Citrus County, and here's Crystal River. They have a wildlife refuge, a pretty good restaurant, and a no longer functioning nuclear power plant. And it's largely a tourism-based economy. Excuse me. And why do people go there? Well, this is why people go there. These beautiful springs, beautiful river, beautiful aquatic recreation. The manatees tend to gather there in the winter as they use it as a thermal refuge. And so it's one of the few places in the world where you can go and legally harass an endangered species by swimming with them and stuff. And people love that. And so as part of this project, we wanted to understand people's mental models of coastal environmental hazards. And so we talked to basically every policymaker who would talk to us in Citrus County, which was not a huge number because it's a small town, or a small county, and Crystal River is a small town. But we wanted to understand how are they thinking about causes and effects of climate change and other coastal hazards. And so climate change, it turns out, with many people were a no-go. I asked about climate change just as one policymaker, and he or she said that while climate change is caused by God and the results are severe weather extremes, melting ice caps, and drought, those are the causes and effects of climate change. And that was it. That was all this person was willing to talk about climate change. Okay. Not a lot to work with there. But we asked the same policymaker, about water quality in Kings Bay, or actually we didn't even ask about water quality in Crystal River or Kings Bay. This person brought it up individually. And all of a sudden we're talking about a much more nuanced understanding of what's going on there. What's causing water quality reduction, what is influencing it, what are the effects of it. This is a really nuanced understanding of what's happening. There's evidence of system thinking here, not a lot of evidence of system thinking there. And so I think this is a really powerful thing to think of. And so we combined all of these policymaker models onto one sort of big model to map this out. And everything in gray here is stuff that was only brought up by the policymakers, stuff that was not brought up by the expert that we interviewed. And you look and they're worried about like manatees and vegetation and water quality and invasive plants and insurance rates and that sort of stuff. And the numbers there are the number of people that brought it up. And then that's much different than what you see when you're talking about like climatic variability. It was raised by 3 people, or increased water temperatures raised by 5 people, but it's a lot less nuanced, this understanding. And if you look at sea level rise, they all talked about it, but only 2 of them raised it by themselves. I had to bring it up specifically for the other 6 who are represented on this map. And so we're talking about a much more nuanced understanding. So think about that message, right? And that is, we need to be talking about issues that are salient and important to the stakeholders. And I see now we're running out of 20 minutes. I blame the technical difficulties, but the one thing that I want to focus on real quick is you also got to think about the medium or who's doing it, right? This is more Yale.
Hello? Stuart, if you can hear us, hang on a second. We're having technical difficulties again. Okay, you're back.
Am I back? Okay, I apologize. We're running low on time, so I will cruise through this and we can talk about it later. But what's important is this. Right here, going back to those farmers, who is influential with them? And these are these dealers, Jess. There's your chemical dealers. I think they mean like fertilizers, not like drugs. And then there's seed dealers, family members, other farmers. Way down that list is extension. Way down that list is extension in terms of who is influential. But when you look at those influential advisors when it comes to climate change, they really trust extension. So there is a role for extension when talking about climate change in agriculture in the Midwest, but the role is talking to advisors, not talking to farmers. And this study can be repeated everywhere and should be repeated everywhere because the people that we're talking to and what we're talking about are going to vary system by system. And Sea Grant's always, has talked about this before. We know that this is the case. But I think it makes a really compelling argument for doing the social science research that we do to really understand a system. When we're looking at this house, are we talking about sea level rise? Should we be talking about storm resilience? Should we be talking about insurance savings? Should we be talking? Or should somebody else be doing the talking? And that's a really important thing to consider. And the only way to answer that question is through social science, and more specifically, the types of qualitative and quantitative research that people like me get funded to do. And thinking about this idea of a co-benefits approach, right, of thinking about adaptation actions that can help in multiple ways, I think is a critical framework that we should be discussing going forward. Because by doing that, we can leverage what people are interested in, what people are worried about, and use this leverage, right, to shape messages and to shape products to really help us try to hit our target with our extension and our outreach work, or maybe more importantly, at least not miss. And the last thing I want to leave you with, and I apologize for the technical difficulties, is that, but everything I'm talking about is a hypothesis, right? We think co-benefits should be a great way to talk about things. We think that this type of messaging strategy might work versus another one, but this needs to be tested because we don't know. It's possible that, people just won't listen when we're talking about climate adaptation no matter what. And I think this needs to be explicitly studied as well. And so Texas Sea Grant, we have this Texas Climate Literacy and Capacity Building Project, and I'm launching a survey theoretically in 2 days, more likely in a week, looking at coastal planners. And we're going to, try to specifically figure this out. Are people more likely to adapt to a specific climate change effect than climate change generally? And if so, how can we message around that? And if we don't explicitly study it, then what we're doing is telling stories and developing hypotheses, but we're not creating actionable knowledge that can be generalized to other places. And that's kind of my main message. I'll leave us with, again, the horrifying chart of sea level rise, just so we remember that, the clock is ticking. And that seems particularly more salient now than it perhaps did a few months ago. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Stuart, thank you so much. And it turns out that we here in Silver Spring might be the only ones who were having the technical difficulties.
Oh.
So apparently we kept interrupting you for no reason. So
well, that's fine. I take
apologies.
back everybody who heard all the things I said. I think I lacked profanity, but if not, I apologize.
I'm going to turn this over to Kim to ask a couple questions that we've gotten. So go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, I'm going to put these out there because there's two questions that are quite related from Jen Henderson, who's an almost fully minted PhD in STS from Virginia Tech, and Mike Ignato from the University of Maryland. Both ask this question. So what is it about people believing in the anthropogenic cause of climate change that's so important? Does that affect their behavior in some way? Does it help them drive toward positive change? What is it that's important about that piece? And does it matter is the question they posed.
I think those are excellent questions. And Jen, I think was your name. If you want more PhD studies, I think there's a lot of research to be done in that area. And so I think, I'll tell you what, let me turn off this dumb video thing so it doesn't eat up all my RAM. Anyway, sorry about that. So the answer is that it both makes all of the difference and no difference whatsoever, depending on the way that you're looking at it. The reason I bring it up is because if you're thinking about climate change adaptation versus climate change mitigation, the belief in anthropogenic climate change is key there, okay? And for those of you who don't know, adaptation means doing something to prevent the effects of climate change or to prevent yourself or others from being harmed by the effects of climate change, whereas mitigation is doing something about climate change happening, the existence of climate change. And so if you don't believe that people are causing climate change, you're highly unlikely to take significant mitigative actions to prevent climate change from occurring. And so we're at a, I am not a climate scientist, obviously, but we're in the midst of an inflection point where if we're trying to hit those really aggressive goals of limiting it to 2 or 2.5 degrees Celsius in terms of amount of warming, if a significant number of people, including in the government and of the populace of the biggest emitter of carbon emissions in the world, or one of the biggest emitters of carbon emissions in the world, don't believe that carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change, that changes the operating environment for climate change mitigation. So it matters deeply in terms of that. It might matter deeply, this is a research question, it might matter deeply in terms of talking about climate change. I don't think that you're likely to inspire people who don't believe in climate change mitigation or who don't believe in anthropogenic climate change. You're not likely to inspire them to action if you're talking about greenhouse gas reductions. But the other side of that is I say that it doesn't matter at all. Because in my opinion, based on this and some other studies that I've done that I had to cut out because I only wanted to go 5 or 10 minutes long, based on some other studies, like it makes a lot of sense, in my opinion, for organizations like the Sea Grant and even the outreach parts of NOAA to be focused on climate change adaptation. Because individuals can make a difference in their own climate change adaptation and in their community adaptation. Individual people can make a much bigger difference than they can on the global greenhouse gas emission issue. That is a big problem. Adaptation is also a big problem, but a lot of times there are very local solutions. And so in some ways it doesn't matter what people believe. If they believe in climate change or if they are worried about one of the effects of climate change, whether or not they believe in climate change itself, then I would argue that it makes a lot of sense to focus on those sorts of issues, and people's beliefs in anthropogenic climate change don't actually matter. Which is a long-winded way of answering that question, but I think I addressed it. If not, let me know.
Thanks, Stuart. We have a couple other questions. Another one from Jess at North Carolina Sea Grant, Jess Whitehead. And Stuart, I have some comments on this if you don't. Is there any history of Sea Grant or others working, wait, hang on, I just lost the question, working with religious leaders on the issue of climate change? And that's actually Jane Harrison from North Carolina Sea Grant asked that.
Hi, Jane. I don't know about Sea Grant specifically. I know that there is an increasing move towards, there's an increasing how do I want to say this carefully? People are studying the connection between religion and climate change. I know that, Elizabeth, you can probably comment on some of what Ed Maybach did with the Pope and climate change. My main thought on that is he made his climate change comments on the exact same day I had a paper came out, so he absorbed my media coverage, which is fine. He's more important than I am. But it seems like when Pope Francis made his comments on climate change, that seems to have affected a lot of people. I don't know what Sea Grant is doing specifically. Elizabeth, you might have some info on that.
Yeah, so Sea Grant has not, as far as I know, and I try to keep abreast of these things, Sea Grant has not done any specific research on working with religious leaders, but certainly lots of the programs work with churches and other religious leaders as, voices of knowledge and for more of a social consensus. So I know that's been happening across the network. That's something I know Cooperative Extension does as well. In fact, they have volunteer organizations aimed at that exact thing, not just for climate change, but for other scientific issues they're trying to get raise public awareness on. But yeah, Stuart brought up Ed Maybach and lots of research with the Pope. We even have a big picture of the Pope in the Center for Climate Change Communication now, like right next to all the PhD students. So
honorary fellow.
Yeah, absolutely.
and one area where you might see it, actually thinking about, as soon as I hang up here, I've got to go finish a grant proposal that I'm working on with some folks here. It's an outreach research, an extension project looking at hazard resilience. And so you might find it in underrepresented communities in the greater Houston area. And so you might find that a lot of the work is being done there, because if that gets funded, then my main interest will be in climate-related stuff and working with the communities, although there's also going to be a significant public health component and so on and so forth. So I would say that there's avenues to be explored there would be my statement.
Great. Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions, so I'm going to move on. This is from Deborah Sealer at California Sea Grants, and she wants to know if, Stuart, if you can share the survey language used, or if there's a way to repeat this opportunity to help people across the network or this network find trusted sources of information. So for where you found out where they get their information, can you share that?
Yeah, sure. You can contact me after. I can literally send you the survey, or if you go look, I believe it'll be in either Linda Prokopi's article on the extension, which is on my website, but I can send it to you, on extension's role in climate change information. That's something that she and I and several other people wrote, or it'll be as part of one of the other U2U adjacent publications. But I think that absolutely we should look at that language, or use it as a base, or find some other language. But I think that taking that idea and trying to understand where can we be most efficient and effective is critical, because you don't want to talk past somebody. I've got 2 kids. I do enough of that at home. And so at work, we want to be, much more effective than I am at home.
Excellent. And Deborah, I can put you in touch with Stuart, or of course you could use the new and very exciting Sea Grant National Address Book on our website to get his contact info. All right, we have another question. Anybody? Okay, so a question, I'm going to butcher your name, Mula, I think, from University of Wisconsin Extension. What can you tell us about why farmers and farm advisors are misinformed about climate change and the human causes?
Mula, I don't want to go too deep into that, because the farmer stuff was not something I was involved in. That was mostly completed before I was done. If you want to contact Linda, she could really go into detail. Or shoot, you're in Wisconsin. The Amber Mace, M-A-S-E, she works for the University of Wisconsin Extension as well. She's in Jenna Klink's evaluation group, I believe is what it's called. She is an expert on this. She published on it as well, and done a lot of interviews and qualitative work as well. General comments I can make, though, about that based on my research and others' research is that people's climate change beliefs are really influenced by their values. And there have been a number of ways of looking at it. To me, the one that's most exciting is what they call cultural values. And this is work done by a gentleman named Dan Kahan at Yale University, who is somebody I'm working with some projects on as well. And basically, he has taken cultural values and, based on some other work, split them up. Ooh, hold on. I tried to... No, don't leave the webinar. I tried to get... Are you still there? Sorry, I tried to get too fancy to show you something. Obviously, I'm incapable of doing that. So what Dan did was look at different sets of cultural values and how they influence climate change beliefs. And it turns out that people who are more hierarchical and individualistic, which means they believe that society is set up with kind of a strict hierarchy, and that the people at the top of the hierarchy are, though, winners deserve to win, sort of Gordon Gekko types, versus communitarians or egalitarians, people who believe that society should be set up to help those who, to help each other out, sort of hippies, I guess. Hippies versus mega capitalists, if you will. That really influences how you perceive risk information. And so people who are hierarchical and individualistic are much more likely to not believe in climate change. And so I think that's part of what you might be seeing with the farmers, is that these are really individualistic type people. They tend to be conservative, and conservatives, there's been long known to have been a white male effect on climate change beliefs, and these are largely, if not entirely, well, not entirely, but largely white males, and so you'll see that effect there. What's funny is, though, when we talk about other folks, let's see if I can actually do this. Can you see this? Do you see that graph? Okay,
yes,
here's a study I did looking at scientists. So it's not just people. Scientists are, it's not just the public. Scientists are people too. We looked at cultural values and climate change beliefs among scientists, and found that almost all scientists believed in climate change, but these orange dots people did not. And the orange dots who didn't believe in climate change were all on the hierarchical side of egalitarian hierarchical, except for this outlier, and we're all on the individualistic side of communitarian and individualistic. And so that even holds among scientists. And the white male effect holds there too. And men were 5 times more likely to not believe in climate change than were women in our sample. Now, there was still very few people, but we found there was an effect of cultural values. We found that there was an effect of gender. And so that's a chunk of what's happening. That is not all of what's happening. And really, I recommend hooking up with Amber or Linda if you want more information on that.
Excellent, thank you. And Deidre Peroff, also Sea Grants, has a similar question about the post surveys and the farmers. Maybe you can talk to Stuart, Deidre as well, and get that information about the surveys. So we have another question from Nancy Trick. I think I'm saying your name right. Stuart, can you provide examples of other scientific topics that have had the same amount of emphasis placed on public opinion or belief?
Yes, not things that I work on, but the classic ones are things like GMOs. Public belief of GMOs is a big topic of study. Vaccines, that's one that I look into a lot because we have kids, and with some of the people we associate with, we get to talk about the vaccine controversy plenty. Those are kind of some of the big ones. And what's interesting about those is those same cultural values matter, except in the other way. People who are more communitarian and egalitarian are much more likely to be concerned about vaccines and concerned about GMOs than are people who are more hierarchical and individualistic. So same things influence risk perceptions. But those are ones where public belief has been a big deal. Evolution is one that is a big deal. But these aren't things that I tend to focus on in terms of Sea Grants. So beyond just introducing those topics, I can that's about all I can say on them. Now, if your broader question is why do we focus this much on, and it might not be, so I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but so why is this such a big darn deal? Climate change beliefs, why don't we just press on regardless? And the answer is that when you're talking about adaptation, you need public buy-in. And when you're talking about large-scale public policy, you need public buy-in. And so, the controversy is an important aspect of that.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of great risk communication work going on about topics like that. One of my professors, Chris Clark at George Mason, has written some great stuff on fracking, GMOs, and vaccines. So I highly recommend his work as well. Another one from Jen?
Yeah, all right. So Jen Henderson, again, asking a question, weather and climate work aren't often connected in terms of communication, beliefs, behavior, at least she says in her opinion. She asks, what kinds of research, if any, is being done to understand connections of extreme weather and extreme climate events? So think about this in terms of religion, how it affects adaptation or evacuation actions. Or what work is or ought to be done to connect weather and climate work in terms of people's beliefs and actions?
Thanks for that question, Jen. That is a good question. And the answer is, I can only answer vaguely. There is work being done on that weather and climate connection. And I think that it's important. That is not what I've delved into before. And so I've reviewed the literature in the past, and I'm not up on what the latest thing is when it comes to that. But the idea of that connection is extremely important because there's a lot of evidence to show that people very often confuse climate and weather. And that's one of the very first things I'm working on with this Texas Climate Literacy Program is I am trying to let's start with that. What is the difference between weather and climate? And research question, does helping people clarify that difference change their attitudes towards climate change? Like when they understand that any given weather extreme may be weather, but it may or may not be evidence of the climate, and really drilling down on that from an outreach and education standpoint, does that make a difference? And that is some of the research that I hope to tack on to what's doing. But I am not as in the weeds on that specific, the specific connections being made there. I do know that the drought, people did not necessarily connect the drought with climate change on any sort of broad scale. The drought, the Midwestern drought that we talked about. But beyond, and I know that people in another survey I did way back in grad school, people didn't necessarily associate things like the really bad hurricane season in 2004 in Florida with climate change. And so, there's a lot of work that is being done. I'm just not an expert on it in terms of the connection between weather, extreme events, and climate change. In particular, that weather versus climate change connection, whether or not people are making it and what that means if they are. In terms of extreme events.
I don't know if you can hear us, Stuart. We just lost you again.
Okay.
So we're going to interrupt. Kim has, Klopka has something to say about that topic too.
Great.
Yeah. So I'll take a programmatic bend to that. That's something that actually here at headquarters in OER, going into the next administration, there's some thought about what we might want to consider for the coming years programmatically. And there's definitely been an interesting uptick in recent years as more of the social behavioral sciences have come on board to study weather problems in the maybe co-opting of some of the language that's used in climate. So we talk about trying to increase adaptive capacity and resiliency. And we might need to start thinking about what that really means on different timescales. So there's different parts of NOAA that are working on short fuse adaptation, adaptive capacity, and the National Weather Service's operations are geared more toward that. The folks in the RESA programs and in Sea Grant maybe can look to the long-term time horizon and see some of the things that we have to take as fixed they could see as variable and start to work with those capacities. So I think your question, Jen, actually has a really interesting organizational slant to it that is starting to get some conversation here as people are thinking about the years to come.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim. So we're having a lot of questions come in. We only have about 10 minutes left. So I think we're going to have to, Nicole and James and
he has an answer.
Yeah, there are a few that we will just forward on to Stuart to see if we can get some answers because we are running out of time.